Welcome, everyone. I'm Michel Alev-Jones, and with my colleagues Fadia Daka and Sabine Schmidt-Lauf, we are the co-conveners of the ESREA STREAM Network. We are happy to welcome you today for this second session of our 2024 Research Symposium series on spaces and times of transition. Today, we have the pleasure to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Arpad Szakolczai from University of College in Cork, Ireland. Arpad is a researcher known for his work in sociology, social theory, and cultural analysis. Today, he will introduce his research around the notion of liminality. We're expecting his reflections to help us understand better what is at stake with critical events or transitional situations that involve the dissolution of a form of order, but which also are formative or transformative, including at the level of institutions and social structures. As for the other sessions of this research symposium series, this presentation will be recorded and later posted online. It will be followed by half an hour of Q&A at the end, which won't be recorded. During the presentation, feel free to use the chat to share your ongoing reflection, reactions, or questions. Arpad, thank you very much for having accepted our invitation, and we are impatient to listen to you. You have the mic now.
Thank you very much, Michel. Thank you very much for this kind invitation in this strange kind of setting, which for me is still strange in the sense that we are not in a room together, but sort of somehow in space. Anyway, no, I listened to the introductory meeting the last time with quite attention and trying to calibrate my talk. And so I want to start by two preliminary comments before I go into my theme. One is about adult education, which is, the network is clearly about adult education. I'm just a normal professor in some kind of way, but I had some experiences in some way with education in that kind of sense, which could be relevant. On the one hand, in Cork, for various sort of reasons, when I started in the late 1990s, there were quite a lot of mature students, which is not the same as adult education specifically, but still, compared to my previous education experiences, it was quite different in the sense that they were not 18-year-olds going into university or 21-year or 22 years old going into postgraduate education, but there were quite a number of people who were in their 30s, 40s, even 50s for various sort of reasons. And the interaction of the younger students and the mature students was very interesting for me. And I think that was an interesting experience of how it helped actually young students, 18, 19-year-old students, that they were in the room, some older people with their experiences. So I think that is very important, because in the previous education experiences which I had in different countries, it was almost, I mean, Hungary in that sense was very particular, that at 18 you started university, and if you were 19, you were old, 17 you couldn't be. And so that everybody was basically a half a year younger or older than you, and that's it, almost literally. And I think France is very similar as far as I can see, or a number of other countries. So that's an interesting education experience in itself. On the other hand, or as kind of second thing is, sort of in my own life with my wife, we had raised some sons. And what was interesting in that regard is that there was a son of ours who was extremely premature, or who at the age of 12 was writing short stories which had a kind of Heideggerian touch to it. I don't know how he did that. And then we had a son who was very late comer, which was not retarded in the usual sense, but who was very slow were going on. So in our own experience, we were very clear about that this kind of educational, streamlining in which you do something at 14, 16, 18, so is somehow terribly misdirected. And of course, it's a difficult thing what to do a younger person who is too mature or an older, but still, so I had my own experience about the different dynamics of simply maturing, and therefore the different dynamics of education should take into account. And the second preliminary remark is about emancipation, because I remember several of you, when introduced the theme, mentioned this theme, which of course is an important theme, and in a way, I don't think that anybody anywhere would oppose the idea. But I see a kind of problem there, and I will touch upon that in a way through liminality again. And this is that the strategy, if you want, of emancipation is with us since at least 2 centuries. And the results of certain or quite a few of policies aiming at emancipation were often, let's say, leave something to be desired. And I think emancipation today is much needed for 2 important parts of previous emancipatory projects. And these are all connected with the hand, because probably you know that emancipation is a Latin word and it means hands off, basically. So it was an old Latin ritual about taking the hands off of the parents, taking the hands off. So that's the origin of emancipation. Then the 2 key words which I want to sort of filter in is manipulation and management. Now, manipulation and management are both words which are linked to the hands. So manipulated, when you are using your hands for something, and of course, manipulation is very much connected to the media. And media are major forces of manipulation, often considered to be a kind of forces of emancipation, especially in a kind of Habermasian reading of the public sphere, which I found very problematic, because it is the media and the public sphere which perform this kind of manipulation almost by itself, not just one or other particular media. So it is the media manipulation against which we need to be emancipated. And the other is management, which you certainly are familiar with the current managerial system. And I lived well over 30 years, because now I retired, in various universities in which I lived through basically a managerial takeover at the universities. It was interesting that that was done in the name of democratization. And so as we are all, I guess, involved in some kind of universities, we must think about that, what was really going on. Because in my experience, in the kind of educational systems, I have some degree of familiarity, the Irish, the English, and the American. This kind of managerial control made the educational life way worse than it was 30 or 40 years ago. And these changes, which resulted in this kind of managerial bureaucracies, were presented as a kind of democratic reforms. I don't know whether you agree with me, but I certainly lived through that in several different places. And this is something to think about. So how to think about emancipation without risking to continue the same kind of entrapment into various modes of management and manipulation. Okay, so that's just a kind of preliminary. And now I move on to the term liminality and the connection between liminality, transition, and experience. That would be the main theme of my talk. Now, I want to start with the conceptual history of the term liminality, partly because it is important to introduce the term. I think that by now the term liminality is quite well known. I'm not sure how many of you who are hardly ever or never heard the term, because it's still not a common term in most areas of the social sciences and the humanities. But also because liminality has a very particular conceptual history, which in a kind of nutshell reveals manifold problems of the intellectual history of the last long century. Now, the term liminality and the related word, because not liminality exactly, because it was in French, but in French it was liminaire, was introduced by Arnold van Gennep in his 1909 book, Le Rite de Passage, or Rites of Passage. Now, van Gennep was a main classic figure in anthropology, and he intended at that time, sorry, what it interrupts, as a kind of foundational work for anthropology. Now, van Gennep was a university friend and mate of Marcel Mauss. This is not very well known for a number of reasons, but I cannot go into every deramations. They were so close university friends that when van Gennep wrote his thesis and it was published, Marcel Mauss read the proofs, and van Gennep acknowledges Mauss reading the proofs. So they were very close university friends. But when van Gennep wrote this book, The Rites of Passage, Durkheim was actually preparing his own book in which he wanted to give a kind of philosophical, theoretical foundations to anthropology on completely different lines. And so Van Gennep and Durkheim became at loggerheads. And as a result, Durkheim, who was much more powerful, simply excluded Van Gennep and his work from sociology. Literally, Van Gennep practically never had a university position. So the term liminality was very little used for quite a long time until it was translated 50 years later into English. So rites of passage were considered as a kind of ethnographic, ethnological, it depends on, again, which country has the terminology, folkloristic book, not related to anthropology in a serious theoretical manner. Now, rites of passage, however, introduced this term liminality in a very simple way, and I talk a little bit about rites of passage. That is, according to Van Gennep, rites of passage has a kind of tripartite, threefold sequential structure. There are sort of rites of preliminary rites, preparations for a kind of ritual. Then there is the ritual performance or the ritual testing or trial in which somebody had to show of being ready to pass through a particular event of life. These rites of passage were, the main rites of passage were, of course, initiation rites, like initiation into adulthood, or marriage is a rite of passage. Then there were rites of passage related to birth and death. So basically, any transition of human life was accompanied by rites of passage. Van Gennep said that this is a kind of basically a universal, every society, every culture, every community had its own rites of passage. And then after the successful performance or the passing of the trial, it is very important that these rites of passage were hardly ever competitive. They were not competitive rituals. Everybody was supposed to pass the trial. So let's say if somebody was an adolescent, was supposed to become an adult, but occasionally under exceptional circumstances, one could fail a rite of passage in like a marriage supposed to succeed. But if for one reason or another, somebody doesn't perform the right movements and doesn't say I do, then the marriage will not take place. So it can happen exceptionally, but rites of passage were not competitive rituals at all. And then they ended up by a kind of rite of reaggregation in which the initiants and the people who pass through the ritual return to their community now in their new status. Now, I can talk more about the rite of passage as a ritual in case it is necessary, but I think that is sufficient to give a kind of account on what a rite of passage is. And so therefore liminality is a term which captures this kind of transitoriness, how individuals or collectivities move through the different cycles of life or the cycles of seasons, because, for example, seasonal rituals were communal rite of passage. And liminality, the term which Van Gennep introduced in this way, was supposed to be really a kind of fundamental, even foundational term for social understanding. That is how various elements and events of social life can be understood as a kind of a passage or as a kind of rite of passage. Now, the second stage, let's say, in the conceptual history was when Victor Turner in the 1960s, and practically by accident, picked up this book, which was translated into 1960 in England. And Victor Turner, who was educated in London, Oxford, and Manchester, in the centers of British academic life, never heard of Van Gennep, and nobody knew about this type of work, and realized that he all the time was looking for something like that, and introduced various terms like social dramas and so on. And what he was always looking for but couldn't find was Van Gennep's work on rite of passage. So that's the second moment in which liminality through Victor Turner became a term used in social anthropology. Then it moved in the 1990s, 1980s, 1990s. It started to be picked up by sociologists. The two most important were Schmoll Eisenstadt, who organized a conference, and it was the first conference on liminality and by sociologists. by a kind of a very sad coincidence, Victor Turner died literally weeks after this conference. And then Zygmunt Bauman picked up the term in the early 1980s. Zygmunt Bauman is, of course, very well known as a sociologist. And Bauman's liquid modernity really was developed on the basis of his reading of liminality, just that after a time he started to use the term liquidity instead of liminality. The last step, let's say, in the conceptual history was as a kind of follow-up to Bauman and Eisenstadt, when in the late 1990s and then in the new century, there were two groups of people especially. I mean, there were several who were using the liminality. One was Jeffrey Alexander and Ben Giesen. Jeffrey Alexander is a very well-known American social theorist. He was, I think he's still in Yale, but he was professor in UCLA and Yale and Hadley Department and so on. And Ben Giesen was a German, quite well-known German sociologist and cultural theorist. He was based in Constance. He was retired and died a few years ago, but I think several people must have heard of Ben Giesen's work. And they were using liminality as part of a performative term in sociology. So theater, rituals, performances, what is the significance of performances for social life or for political life? So their work contained analysis, for example, of political events and political leaders as some kind of ritual leaders, or their performances could be analyzed through liminality and rite of passage. And the second group of people, and this is where I sort of more closely belonged, was the journal International Political Anthropology, which was founded to introduce a series of anthropological concepts to analyze contemporary politics and society, which were deemed to be particularly helpful, but which were very little used in social and political analysis, like liminality or like trickster or like schismogenesis. Okay, now I now want to introduce a series of, let's say, further developments in liminality analysis, or ways in which the concept was taken up and analyzed, especially in this group around international political anthropology. The first such term is permanent liminality. Now, permanent liminality is, strictly speaking, a kind of non sequitur or nonsense, because a liminality is a temporary situation, a transition between two different states. And yet, there are liminal situations which can become permanent. And I, in particular, thought and used this term, taking up from Victor Turner, who used it in a very particular context. And I consider that permanent liminality captures quite closely much of the contemporary condition. This kind of situation in which something which seems to be a temporary, just a passing situation, becomes permanent. The second point is that liminality can be instrumentalized. I mean, liminality is usually a transition situation, and I will use a series of other terms just to illustrate the range of applicability. So these transitory situations, let's say, must be temporary and must be sort of resolved. So let's say if somebody is sick, illness is a typical liminal situation, one has to recover, or a teenager must become an adult. And yet a transitory situation, or people who are caught in a transitory situation, this situation can be instrumentalized for certain purposes. The third point is that liminal situations can be forced outright. That is, people can be forced for one reason or another into a transitory situation or into a suspended in-between situation because they can be particularly easily manipulated in a kind of in-between situation. So if people have a degree of stability, they have people to turn to, they have a kind of understanding of their situation. But when they move between places, they are temporarily uncertain or vulnerable. And so liminal situations can actually be used and abused in various kinds of ways. Now, the first point is that liminality was introduced as a kind of sequential to events, or give a sequential structure to events. So liminality was understood in time. But liminality can also be understood in space as well. That is, there are situations which are liminal in terms of space and not in terms of time. So not in terms of growing up, not in terms of falling ill and recovering, but in terms of moving in space. Now, a metaphor which I always use for students to introduce liminality is something like a door. So if there is a wall is a limit, a separating boundary between two different places or two different rooms. The door is the liminal space in which one can move from one room to another. So let's say rooms or houses are relatively stable places when people are. A door is a liminal space between two rooms. But a door is also an interesting space in the sense that if somebody is at the door, literally on the threshold, then sees into both rooms. So it is a kind of privileged space from which one can see into both of the rooms. So if somebody is in a room, that's a stable situation. One knows who is there, understands it, it's his own room or whatever room to which one is used to. There is another room in which there are other people, but somebody on the door sees both. And yet it also indicates the ambivalence of a liminal situation, because if somebody is at the door, they can see into both rooms, but don't belong to any of the places. So liminality involves this strange game between participation and non-participation. And liminality as a spatial concept can help to illustrate it. Now, through the spatial aspects of liminality, one can rethink marginality and centrality as part of a rather complex figuration or configuration. That is, what is marginal, what is liminal, and what is central. That without liminality, it's very clear what it is. The center is the center, it is in the middle, it is what is ruling, what has the power. Marginal places are far from the center. As we understand them, they're marginal, irrelevant, have no power. And yet, a marginal place can become a liminal place in the sense of mediating between two centers. And then this marginal place can become more important than the central, exactly in the same way that a door mediates between two rooms. Or let's say a marginal place which is situating in between two regions can develop into a center. Now, I have a very simple example for that, and it's a very important example, and that is Antwerp. Which is a town in Flanders, which, of course, you all know about. And Antwerp is in between France and Germany. So let's say France and Germany are, for many, many centuries, the big countries. Flanders is a kind of small in-between zone, which is in a way half French, half Flemish, which is not German, but which is a kind of very German. No, and sort of Antwerp, compared to Paris or Berlin, is a very small city. Yet it is in Antwerp that the first stock market emerged. So, and the other place is actually Lyon. And Lyon has the same kind of in-between status between France and Italy. And it's quite an interesting thing that Antwerp and Lyon, these two, if you want, relatively marginal places. I mean, Lyon is not so marginal, but at that time was less central than it is now. But when they gave rise to the stock market, then this is really something quite central. So they were the central places of power for some time. So a marginal place in between two larger territories or larger entities can become a kind of liminal place, which in a certain kind of way can become central. And one can continue this kind of examples for relatively marginal places, which under certain circumstances can become central because they will be liminal instead of just being marginal. A sixth difference, let's say, innovation or taking up of liminality is that, again, liminality developed out of rituals, but liminality can be considered, or real-world large-scale events can also be considered as liminal. That is, events which are out of the ordinary, sudden sudden events which move a particular region or a country or an entire civilization into a kind of new kind of situation. So transition, let's say, in a historical or world historical sense, that can also be considered. So a world war or a revolution is also a liminal event, and there are important analyses using liminality, for example, of revolutions. And finally, liminality helps to understand what it means to be on the limit. Now, this is a theoretically very important situation. And this is a situation, and this I consider particularly important, which is impossible to characterize and understand through the standard techniques of rationality. So, for example, in Kantian philosophy, it is unintelligible. Now, I don't want to go too much into philosophy, but you know certainly something about Kant. And for Kant, the limits and the boundaries are constructs of the transcendental mind. So it is the theoretician who defines the boundaries. The world is a chaos, so there is a need to give limits to this chaotic world. But therefore, these limits are simply theoretical categories. In liminality analysis, however, the point is that there are limits which are there in real life, in all kinds of natural limits or limits between different kinds of places, like the door is a limit, and one can be on the limit. This is not foreseen by Kantian philosophers, and part of the hostility of Durkheim to Van Gennep was related to that. Durkheim was a very deeply Kantian, neo-Kantian philosopher, and he operated in dualistic and deconomizing categories, setting up the classificatory systems, for example. The famous essay of Durkheim was on classificatory schemes. And these classificatory schemes are constructions of the mind. However, in real life, one can actually be on the limit. And for example, again, adolescents are just like that. So there are children, there are adults, but you can be on the limit. And being on the limit is in a way very natural. I mean, anybody has to grow up. Being a teenager is natural. But then a teenager has to leave his childness in a way, become an adult. And that's a difficult adjustment process when somebody is actually on the limit. And what happens on the limit, it's a very delicate situation, which combines in a way a kind of intoxicating freedom. You are on the limit. The limit doesn't hold on you. You are there. You are on the limit. But it's also anguishing uncertainty. So you are on the limit. What happens with you? Before you knew what to do. Later, you will eventually know what to do, but you are at that moment, you are on the limit. And this combination of freedom and anxiety, it's a very, very fundamental experience. And this helps, for example, to understand this permanent liminality of modernity, or what is it that is so specific about the modern experience, this perceived or alleged limitlessness. There are no limits. Any limit is just a kind of taboo, it's old-fashioned, whatever. There are no limits. And yet this freedom at the same time also generates anxiety and uncertainty. So the age of freedom is also the age of uncertainty. You read Kierkegaard and you get a different feeling than if you read whatever economic theorist who tells you about that we are free to choose and so on. And in particular, and that's the last term I want to introduce, liminality is a kind of void situation, void. And it's like Nietzsche and facing the abyss. So liminality is the Nietzschean abyss situation, a void, horror vacui. You feel that you are in a void. It's very important that one of the most important liminal rituals are actually the mortuary rituals or burial, something like that, so related to death. And death, of course, is the void. And in the case of a death, it is not the person who is passing in the liminal ritual. We don't know what happens with the person who died, but it's the community or the people, the parents and the friends who have to accommodate to pass through this void of his absence. And actually, Van Gennep said that this kind of funerary rites are the most important liminal rituals, which are connected to death and void and destruction. So liminality is anguishing because it actually involves this void experience. Now, however, there are also a number of terms, and I want to move from liminality, the term liminality, to a number of terms which have affinity to liminality. But liminality is a concept of social anthropology introduced by Van Gennep. But what is interesting is that liminality has close equivalence actually in philosophy. In my article, I wrote about that because liminality is a Latin word. But if you translate liminality into ancient Greek, then the word in ancient Greek would be apeiron. And actually, apeiron is the first word of Greek philosophy. That is the first fragment of the first pre-Socratics, the only authentic fragment of Anaximander is about the apeiron. And actually, the translation of the apeiron gave a long-standing difficulty to philosophers. What does apeiron mean? It means limitlessness or infinite or unbounded, but the Greeks didn't have a concept of infinite as we are having, so infinite doesn't work. And infinite is the same word again as liminal, because liminal, finite, finish, limit is the end. And then the apeiron is, peiras means the limit in Greek, so apeiron is the limitless, and the liminal is the limitless already in the Van Gennepian terminology, because this is when you are on the limit, you are passing a limit between two ages, whether it's the limit of the birth or death or marriage or something like that. So liminality in a way is the first word of Greek philosophy in terms of the apeiron. And this word apeiron was taken up by the Pythagoreans. It's a central word in Pythagorean theory, and it is very important for Plato. I don't have time to go into that, but it's a very important term in Plato. And there is also another Greek word who practically captures liminality, and that is metaxy, which is in-betweenness. So the meta is even in a kind of Latin context or European context, there are many words that you can understand that as a kind of mean or in-between. Metaxy simply means being in between, and that is again an important term in Plato's thinking. And the metaxy is discussed in particular in the Symposium. And in the Symposium, Plato says that eros is a kind of, and eros is like erotics or love, is an in-between situation. It's in a metaxy. So eros is a daemon, and it captures this particular condition of human life, that love is a kind of in-betweenness. So love is always in between two persons. That's why eros was a Greek daemon, and the demons are in between beings, in between not gods, but neither humans, because love is in between. There must be two human beings who love each other. You cannot just love somebody who doesn't love. That's a kind of obsession or something like that, or it's not, that's not really love. Anyway, so it's an important Greek term, even metaxy. The third word which I want to introduce really in philosophy is experience. Now, when Victor Turner first discovered Van Gennep's work and liminality, and then 10 years later, he made another major discovery. And this is really, this I consider to be one of the most important events in the intellectual life of the 20th century, because Victor Turner picked up the work of Wilhelm Dilthey. Now, I'm not sure whether many of you know about Dilthey. Dilthey is a quite well-known philosopher, German philosopher. He belongs to the hermeneutical tradition, sort of in between Schleiermacher and Heidegger and Gadamer. Dilthey was very important for Max Weber, for example. So if you know something about Max Weber, you must have encountered the work of Dilthey, because Max Weber several times figures out Dilthey, that Weber is talking about interpretive or understanding sociology, Verstehen sociology, and Verstehen is a concept from Dilthey. And now, but Dilthey is not very well known for a complex set of reasons. Again, I cannot go into the details, but anyway, Dilthey was only translated into English in the 1970s. Dilthey died in 1911 again. And Victor Turner picked up Dilthey's book, and he had this kind of literal illumination that Dilthey was searching to understand experience beyond Kant. And beyond Kant's idea that experiences are constructed and by the categories of answer, no, experiences are real, said Dilthey. they have their own structure. And Dilthey couldn't fully substantiate this term. Dilthey, by the way, took his word for experience, Erlebnis, from Goethe. And Goethe is an important figure for Nietzsche as well as Max Weber. And Victor Turner said that, wait a minute, this is it, liminality, rite of passage, this is a ritual, this is empirically based. This is what Dilthey was looking for. So what Turner claimed is that liminality resolves this fundamental paradox of modern philosophy, which Dilthey perceived with purely rationalistic accounts of experience. And Victor Turner wrote a few articles about that, but then, as I already said, that Victor Turner also died basically before these articles were even published. So they were published after he died as a kind of seminar papers. So this fundamental discovery of Turner concerning Dilthey, rites of passage, liminality, and transitions is not a common knowledge. And so this is basically the core of my talk, which I now want to sort of go around in some kind of way. This connection between these three words, liminality, transition, and experience. So transition is an experience. A transition is not simply a kind of passage in which it is clear enough what will be there at the end. Now, actually, I encountered the terminology of liminality through my work about transition to democracy, because that's of course, anybody knows about transition theory and transition to democracy. And I was somehow unhappy with the standard approaches to transition to democracy, because it basically said that, here is democracy, which as if it would be perfectly clear what it is, democracy. And then, of course, what is democracy? Is it American democracy or French, or whether in politics or in ideas? There are many different kinds of views about democracy. And democracy is a very delicate word, because today practically everybody is a democrat, but most people understand it in slightly different ways. But at any rate, basically to claim that, you just have to follow, it is there. Transition to democracy, here there is democracy, now you have to move there. Now, as you can imagine, I was growing up in Hungary under communism, so that was certainly not a very happy experience. And from Hungary at that time, it seemed very simple of what democracy means. Now it is, for anybody, is much less simple, much less evident. But anyway, when I started to work on this transition to democracy theme, I said that it's not so simple that, everything is just given, you just have to go there, it's just a transition. No, the process is very much important, and that's how I got interested into liminality, in terms of liminality and transition as an experience. So transition, experience, and liminality are sort of three words in a kind of triangle in which they almost mean the same thing, but they are not completely identical. So there are all kinds of tensions and reverberations that can be played out between these three different words. And actually, Victor Turner even went into the etymology of experience and found extremely interesting things, namely that the etymology of the word experience, which of course is Latin, is experience. So there is this root per, which is a major root, is at the origin. And this Indo-European room actually means a dangerous passage. So the passage is there at the etymological origin of experience as per. By the way, I mentioned already apeiron, the Greek word, that has the same etymological origin as experience in English. So there is quite a convergence around this idea of a dangerous passage, an experience as a dangerous passage. How to navigate our lives through this kind of dangerous passages, where these passages give out us freedom, but also render our life possibly difficult. So anthropology, philosophy, linguistics converge around these triple themes of experience, passage, and liminality. And there will be a fourth one I will introduce very soon. Just I mentioned a number of other words which capture this. I already mentioned in between or in-betweenness. It's a very important term. It's a kind of concept between what is an in-between space, or what can be called an in-between, or interstices, interest is again another words of in-betweenness, passage. The word passage, I mean, a rite of passage is already a passage. A passage is a transition. The term passage, for example, is central for Walter Benjamin. You probably know about the work of Walter Benjamin, and the big work of Walter Benjamin was called Passagen, I think, in German. That's the exact, but Passagen means passages. And that was when he was trying to explore different kind of passages, starting from his experience in Paris, a kind of Baudelairean experience. Because Baudelaire is the poet of modernity, so Baudelaire, Benjamin, the essay of Benjamin on Baudelaire, and Foucault and Baudelaire, they all capture this kind of passages and in-betweenness. Or the last word is crisis. Again, crisis is a word that we use all the time, even extensively. And actually, a crisis means the same kind of passage or transition situation. So whether a crisis is also a kind of transition, sort of in between. A crisis is when something which worked previously no longer works, so stopped, so somehow the previous, whatever it can be, values or institutions or arrangements enter a temporary suspension, and this temporary suspension is a transition to something else. A crisis is a kind of transition, or a transition can be a kind of crisis. The two words are not identical because, let's say, adolescence is a transitional situation. Many adolescents enter a kind of crisis, but it's not necessarily that all adolescents enter a crisis. Although one has to be very careful because the adolescents who seemingly transit the most simple manner, they might produce problems later because they don't even realize what happened with them. So transition and crisis, there is again quite an important connection for that. And a crisis, of course, involves judgment. The Greek word crisis involves judgments, that just as it involves critique. So Reinhard Koselleck has a very important book entitled Critique and Crisis, when Koselleck plays on the manifold meaning of the German word and the judgment that is involved. So any crisis involves a kind of judgment. That's very important because experience and judgment are connected. But these judgments are usually made by people who undergo the crisis, or it can be given from the outside, but how that outside judgment, how that would involve those who participate, that is again a very delicate situation. And after a crisis, now I return to that fourth central word which I mentioned, apart from experience, transition, and liminality, and this is a transformation. Formation and transformation, because again, liminal moments are formative. Let's say an adolescent who undergoes this passage, whether we are not talking about a ritual in a tribal society or whether we are talking about this long-term process by which an adult in a modern, an adolescent in our societies becomes adult. This is formative. It's not defined in advance who that person will be, who became adolescent and then has to become an adult. It's a formative process, formative and might be transformative. It is a transformative which comes in when somebody is formed in some kind of way, but for one reason or another undergoes a transformation. And we all know there can be endless examples about that: marriage, divorce, another marriage, formation, transformation, and so on and so on. So formation is very important. That experiences are formative. Again, that is very fundamental. That here Michel Foucault is very important. Who Foucault was saying is that these are experiences which form the subject, and it's not the subject who has a certain kind of experiences. No primacy of the subject. This is again the reason why Foucault abandoned a kind of Husserlian, Merleau-Ponty, Kantian approach where there is a primacy of the subject. No, there is a primacy of experience, and so one has to analyze the manner in which different experiences form the subject. Okay, now there are the last two short parts of my talk. One, I just want to indicate that this term liminality, which was introduced in anthropology, and I already alluded to that, can be connected to a number of other terms introduced by anthropologists, but which nevertheless have a very strange history inside anthropology. And they hardly are used by anthropologists themselves, not to mention by social theorists, and which is a major problem in terms of our current so-called rationalistic social mode of social theorizing, because these are terms which help to understand ambivalent situations, which are the kind of situations in which we face. One such term is the trickster. The trickster as a word is of course well known. Dickens, for example, wrote a lot about the trickster already in the mid-19th century. But in anthropology, the term was introduced by Paul Radin. It was a little bit before, but Paul Radin is a central figure who was the student of Franz Boas. Franz Boas was the founder of American anthropology, just as Durkheim was the founder of French anthropology. But what is interesting is that Radin, who introduced the term trickster, never got a position in anthropology in the United States until he was something like 72. And the term and Radin became somehow marginalized. I don't want to go into the details of that also because it's very, very unclear. And the term trickster is hardly ever used outside anthropology, or maybe outside certain kind of literary analysis. But the trickster is a very particular kind of figure. It is a kind of a cultural hero or a semi-deity present in many different cultures, who has an ambivalent position, ambivalent relations to knowledge, and who is connected always to liminal situations. So just as liminality is a way to characterize ambiguity of passages of transitions, of being on the limit, the trickster is also a figure who is sort of constantly playing with the limit, playing with transgression, playing with jokes and performances and tales, but who nevertheless can suddenly almost take over power in an entire community. And I cannot go into anthropological tales and folk tales about trickster figures. I just want to indicate the figure of the clown as an equivalent of that, and the demonic clown as a figure which is even in films there and modern novels, sort of clowns or clown-like figures who can suddenly, basically in a nick of time, turn into powerful and extremely demonic figures. So the history of modern wars and modern totalitarian regimes are full of this trickster kind of characters. And I just want to signal, I already mentioned Weber several times, that there is the term charismatic leader, which Max Weber introduced. And this is very widely used, and of course a very important term for politics, because Weber was arguing that, well, usually people talk about traditional leaders or rational leaders, so people who are elected or who are having a position of power due to their traditional, conventional situation and role, or those who have a kind of rational, legalistic claim for power. But Weber said that there is a certain type of people all around history who have a kind of personal power and who gain power under emergency or out of ordinary situations, and introduce the term charismatic leaders. And so when Agnes Horváth, who founded the journal International Political Anthropology, wrote her PhD dissertation on actually the speeches of communist leaders, and then her professors told her that, well, she should use the term charismatic leader. And she said, no, there's no way in which these people can be considered in any meaningful sense charismatics. So what were they? They were traditional leaders, certainly they weren't. Were they rational, elected? They were not. And then eventually, in various kind of ways, she found this term in anthropology, the trickster, and Radin's work of that, and then there are a number of other anthropologists who use that And so the trickster sort of complements liminality, just it complements the sorry, there are two other terms, imitation and the schismogenesis, or the schismogenesis was introduced by Gregory Bateson, another key figure of anthropology who never had, he was one of the first persons who gained a PhD in anthropology in Cambridge University. And even now, if somebody gains a PhD in Cambridge University, is probably will gain a position. He was the first one who gained a position, and he never gained a position in anthropology, because his professors couldn't stomach his innovation in terms of schismogenesis, and because he also said that he was not prepared by his teaching, by his professors, what he encountered in the field and on the field in Papua New Guinea, in witnessing rituals, in witnessing various interactions, he invented that term schismogenesis. That is how identities are developed when sort of communities enter a schism, and so therefore how the two different sides define themselves and define the other as parts of this schism. So the schismogenesis is not simply how something split into two, but how the two sides define their own identities through that division. Now, the last, if I have still 5 minutes or something, according to or 7, I want to return to some of the themes which were singled out in Michel's letter after this introductory meeting. And in a certain way, I covered several of these terms, but maybe I'll just return to some of them more specifically. Well, one is the messiness of the experience of transition. And I think I indicated that pretty well through this concept that transitions are never a kind of clear road from one state to another, but they're always messy and involve experiences by which these transitions sort of are adjusted, and whether these transitions are defined or not as a crisis, or whether they're really a crisis situations or not, whether they are anguishing and so on. They are always messy. Every transition has this own personal kind of messiness. If I may say an aside about that, I think this is very important. I know very little, of course, about adult education, but I have the feeling that one of the reasons why this is so much discussed is the so-called flexibilization of the labor force. Now, I say flexibilization of the labor force, I'm really unhappy about that terminology, and I actually, through another circle of people who had an organization around social pathologies, they clearly define that this sort of flexibility, which is presented as a kind of solution and as a kind of, again, freedom, you are flexible, is actually more a source of uneasiness and really pathological situations. So in my understanding, adult education has the meaning of offering people who, for one reason or another, for example, maybe they weren't mature enough at that age, didn't go through the routine educational routines, and so therefore would like to know something, would like to gain an understanding, would like to give a new perspective on their life, and not simply as a kind of flexibilization of the labor force, because what it implies is a kind of permanent liminality. And this is why I think that term permanent liminality is very fundamental, because permanent liminality at one level is absurd, because one is either a stable situation or is in a transitory situation in moving around, but this permanent liminality is the status to which we are being pushed by our rulers. And who our rulers are, that's a very delicate issue, but they are somewhere there, and I can indicate a few very liminal places like Davos, which is a par excellence liminal spot, by the way, the place of Thomas Mann's great novel, The Magic Mountain. when some of our rulers are preparing our life in terms of permanent liminality and infinite flexibility and zero contract hours and all these kind of things. So the messiness of transitions. Another point is the micro. So how to move in between the micro, the meso, and the macro spheres. And I think liminality is very helpful there, because liminality as a term captures how relatively minor changes involving a few people in a concrete space can eventually become magnified into, through the meso and the macro level, into whatever cultural or civilization-wide transformations. Exactly because liminality happens first at a very small scale. Now, I want to introduce another term, which is a very simple term and easy to understand, very little used, and it's a spiral. The spiral. It's quite amazing that the term is hardly ever used in social and political understanding, the spiral. I mean, it's a kind of everyday term, spiraling growth, for example, but the spiral is actually a concept which helps to navigate between these micro, meso, and macro spheres. That there is a kind of movement which can spiral into, for example, through process of imitation and innovation, and of course, imitation and innovation are connected. So the spiral can help to understand how a liminal situation at one small place can spiral into another one and can actually result in quite significant changes from very minor beginning. And maybe the last term I want to single out is a process as opposed to states, which is a very, very important distinction between very often sort of rationalistic approaches freeze understanding into states. So again, they define their categories, dichotomizing or not. These are the various states, and then you analyze these states. And so a process kind of thinking, it's very important to capture sequences or transitions. In fact, the most famous book of Victor Turner, introducing, among others, liminality, is called The Ritual Process. However, this process, there is also a problem in the sense that when a process is approximating a kind of algorithmic thinking, that is, the process becomes an algorithm in which the steps are defined in advance. And then it is these steps which are supposedly has to be followed. I don't know how many of you have ever tried the venture in this kind of FP7 and other kind of European funding projects. I did it once, and it's actually got it in the final, but we didn't get it. But I really hated it because you had to define in advance what you will do. And I told them that, look, I mean, that's nonsense. Nobody does that. It cannot be done. And this is a way in which we as human beings are forced into the logic of artificial intelligence and algorithms. And that is just terrible. I really don't understand. Again, we are talking about our rulers. So who is doing that? So who thinks that human beings are thinking this way? And then why are they doing that? Or what does it mean? And then, of course, they tell you that, oh, well, you don't have to do that. But it's not like that. And that's my last word. It is a situation with which I was very familiar with under the communist regime. And I'm not joking. Because there, everything, you had to do this or you had to do that. Everything was defined, which nobody did. But what it meant that anybody, anytime, could be held responsible. Because nobody really followed the rigid rules. Everybody knew that. But then the rules were there, and still somebody who came, for whatever reason, like a policeman who wasn't familiar with it, and then they said, but this is the rule. And all of these kind of things which are now imposed on us, this is the kind of managerial bureaucratic revolution, place us in the same kind of situation, forcing us into nonsensical rules, or, for example, appointment procedures in which you have to rank the candidates and who gets the highest number. And anybody knows that if you have 5 candidates, people must get an academic understanding about the qualities of the candidates and what they need. It's not that you say, okay, that's 19 in terms of presentation, 27 in terms of, so you add the numbers and that it comes out. And yet this is the rule, except that the HR representative comes in and tells you, in my experience, that, well, we don't do that. We decide who is the best, and then we give the numbers. But what if the next HR candidate comes and said, no, we have to play by the rules. You give the numbers, and then these numbers you don't even know, and then you give the wrong numbers, and then you exaggerate the numbers, and you enter into the wrong kind of game. And it is this wrong kind of game which is required by algorithms and by rigid processes, and so on and so on. Thank you very much. I think I finished just about an hour. Thank you.